To get started, I'm going to introduce myself as well as the rest of my team. We're a team of 5 educators. And while I'm doing that, if you would go ahead and take the time to introduce yourself as well, just type your name and maybe the grade level that you teach in the chat box as well. So my name is Christy, and I have been teaching for a little over 10 years. I am National Board Certified, and my primary role is to work with English language learners in the content areas. So what I really love to do is help students see and find that connection between language and math. The next person up on our roster is Olivia Alcama, and she is a 5th grade teacher. She has been teaching 5th grade for a long time. Okay, so not super long, but long enough. She has her minors in math and earth science and her master's in educational leadership. Megan Collins teaches 1st grade and has her master's in elementary education. She is our go-to person for lower elementary resources and ideas. Sarah Dewey has taught grades 3, 4, and 5, and she is now an interventionist. She piloted and mastered a workshop model for reading and writing, and she is our workshop model specialist. Kristen Root is an amazing 3rd grade teacher. She has her master's in elementary education. She is awesome at encouraging students to develop number sense and conceptual understanding. So me and these wonderful 4 colleagues worked together for a long time teaching math, and we struggled. We always felt like we were only reaching the middle. We never felt like we were reaching those struggling students, and we weren't challenging the excelling students. And so we decided one day to just get together, do some studying, do some research, and see what we could find that would work for the large range of students that we have in our classrooms. So we got together over a summer, and there was a lake house and some fruity drinks, and after a while we created something that we actually love, and guided math was a big part of that. So really excited to share what we've learned with you, as well as our experiences along the way, and hopefully help you get guided math up and running in your classroom as well. So the research we did consisted of a ton of information from various math gurus such as Lainey Salmons, Joe Bowler, John Vanderwall, Dr. Nikki Newton, and many, many more. So much of what they said really resonated with us. We knew things could be improved and new ideas integrated with a guided math or math workshop approach. So we decided to try it, and ta-da, Zones Math was born. Since then, we have never looked back. So here's our agenda for tonight. We'll cover the terms associated with guided math, and then we will do an overview of each component, including the mini lesson, the workshop time, and the wrap-up. We will end with time for questions as well as a special invitation. So let's start by defining the terms associated with guided math. First, what exactly is guided math? According to Lainey Salmons, guided math is where teachers work with small groups that are determined specifically by students' achievement levels and needs. So when you think of guided math, you would think simply of small group instruction. You have homogeneous, fluid groups that change with the needs of your students, and these groupings are determined by both formal and informal assessments in your classroom. So when you think about small groups, what do you think you can do during that time? Well, during that time, you can closely observe student work, you can monitor student attention, support struggling learners, challenge your proficient learners, and it's also an awesome opportunity to collect authentic data on what your students know and what they still need instruction with. Now, honestly, I love small group time. But this is what I thought of when I thought of small groups. Because really, what is the rest of my class doing besides going crazy? Well, this is where Math Workshop comes in. Math Workshop is where students are engaged in independent, individual, or partner work. The key to starting Math Workshop is establishing rules and routines. Students need to be explicitly taught the goals and expectations of Math Workshop overall, as well as the expectations for each center that students are working in. It's really, really crucial for students to establish a level of independence so that you can pull small groups or push in for individualized conferencing. And to be honest, this takes weeks Don't rush that training piece or you'll be going backwards reteaching that muscle memory. Remember, slow and steady wins the race. We have actually developed a 30-day plan, and it tells you exactly how to accomplish this type of training with your students. So in addition to being trained to work independently, students are given resources to use for independent work so that they don't have to come back to you when they get stuck. We use what we call a resource journal throughout the year, and our students love it, and so do we. You will often hear of math workshops simply referred to as centers or stations. The last note for math workshop is that it's really important that the work you set up is meaningful, not just fluff. This will really increase student engagement as well as their time on task. So when we put guided math together with math workshop, we add in an opening mini lesson and a short closure, we get the complete framework that's called balanced math. So here's a visual of what balanced math should look like when you implement it in your classroom. You have a whole group mini lesson where the teacher addresses the entire class for about 10 to 20 minutes. You really focus on only one learning target during that time. Then the student work time, which we call the workshop, consists of various activities to deepen student engagement and their understanding. The amount of time allotted for stations really depends on your overall math time. It could range anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour. The wrap-up or closure is where the whole group reconvenes and the lesson is wrapped up and learning connections are shared as a group. This generally takes about 10 to 15 minutes. So let's start by taking a look at the mini lesson. Remember, the mini lesson typically comes at the beginning of a class period and lasts only for about 10 to 20 minutes. So take a look at this quote from Dr. John Medina. He says, "The most common mistake we make is relating too much information with not enough time devoted to connecting the dots. Lots of force feeding, very little digestion." Does this sound familiar? It sounded familiar to me. Our days are so rushed, and I was getting so tired of force feeding my students and rushing them to learn. In my setting, I really craved time to slow down because I wasn't seeing any results. My kids were off task after like 10 minutes of instruction, and I felt like I spent the rest of the hour of math trying to reel them back in and get them focused and make them learn. And really, all I was doing was pulling my hair out because after that first 10 minutes, they weren't learning anyways. So the mini lesson really helped alleviate a lot of that stress. And I knew that my students were still learning. So during the mini lesson, you want to directly instruct students on a specific standard. Remember, you're only reaching or only aiming for one learning target. During the mini lesson, you plug in your required district curriculum, whatever your district uses. You can also use this time to introduce any strategies or skills that they will need to be successful. You can go back and revisit any knowledge gaps that you notice with your whole class. This is also a great time to do vocabulary instruction or review of math terms that you've learned. During this time, we also use our whole group mini lessons to add resources to our resource journal. And the most important thing is that your mini lesson does not need to be boring. It's really important that you still use all of those great strategies that keep students engaged and communicating. So during your mini lesson, you can use cooperative group structures. This is a great time to plug in a math talk. You can use SIOP strategies for your ELLs. You can have students work in groups. You can make them turn and talk. Anything to keep them engaged and communicating, as long as you're still focusing on just that one learning point. So now after the mini lesson comes the workshop time. The workshop time, remember, is where students are working independently while you meet with small groups or conference with students. The amount of time here is flexible. It really just depends on how much time you have for math. So why do we want students to work independently? Well, we want students to become responsible for their own thinking. We don't want them to get away with us thinking for them or their classmates thinking for them. Workshop time also breaks the pattern of learned helplessness. Students can't come to you over and over again saying, I don't get it, I don't know what to do. They are trained and they are expected to use their resources and to at least attempt a problem. This struggle really empowers students to become strong mathematicians on their own. The workshop time also gives you the opportunity to differentiate, and students can't hide because they are held accountable for their own work. Depending on the way that you set up your centers or your stations, you can also engage a variety of learning styles. So the students during the workshop time are working independently without your assistance or without your instruction. This makes it really important to go back to that 30 days of training and also to give students appropriate resources and strategies so that they can solve problems on their own. Again, their work needs to be meaningful. Students can work as individuals or with a partner, and depending on your comfortability, they can either work on one task or you can do center rotations. So here's where I want to share with you a little bit about zones. There are a lot of different ideas out there about how you can structure your math class and how you can really structure this workshop time. So you may have heard of ideas like Math Daily 5. You may have heard acronyms such as BUILD or TIME or MATH. And I can't remember the last one, but there is one more. There are many acronyms out there for the way that you can structure your stations. We have tried all of them, and none of them had all of the components that we knew were really important for a great math classroom. And so what we did is when we got together, we looked at, okay, here are all of the things that the research and our own experience tells us is important to have during your math time. We looked at all of those, chose the ones that were the most important and the most effective, and then we created the acronym zones. So you'll see that our acronym has a little bit where things are kind of fudged in there to fit the term. And that's because we really wanted to use the things that we knew were the most effective and that research said were the most important to include in our math classroom. We have used the zone structure, with amazing success in our own classrooms, and it's being used in classrooms throughout the country. So I'll be talking more about zones throughout this webinar and also mentioning a lot of the resources that we've created for you to use. So next we're going to take a look at what your role is, leading small groups and conferencing with students. Remember, this is going on while the rest of your class is working independently. I love small groups. They are amazing because you can differentiate based on your students' needs, and your students can't hide because they are sitting right next to you. It also increases student engagement because they can talk as a small group, and you are also there to hold them accountable. Now, when you form small groups, they're created through data. In this data, you can gather in pre-test, exit tickets, entry tickets, observations during work time. Any data that you gather, you can use to create small groups. On a side note to that, our very own Sarah Dewey will be hosting a free webinar on November 3 on collecting and using data for guided math. So you make sure you won't want to miss that. Your small groups can meet daily. But the great thing about small groups is that they can also meet just on an as-needed basis. So some students meet with you daily, while others you could check in maybe just once a week. If you're looking for a visual for how to pull small groups, you can always check out our YouTube channel. We have a couple of great examples up there for you to take a look at. And now, while I love small groups, conferencing with students is actually my favorite part of math. I absolutely love that I get to dig into their thinking and have meaningful conversations about math on an individual level. Math conferencing really gives me a chance to individualize instruction, and I also get to help develop students' communication skills. So when you conference with a student, you actually go to where the student is working. You start by listening to a student's reasoning, and based on that conversation, you target a specific teaching point with that individual student. The important thing to remember here is that conferencing is meant to be short, only about 5 minutes. So don't belabor the point. Rather, just be direct and then allow the student to continue working. So after you've offered your extra support and coaching, then you want to document that conversation so that you have an informal assessment and you can go back to it for future use. Now, I remember I said I was going to mention a couple of resources that we have for you. One of the resources that we have here is a small group planning form. I use this every day in all of the classes I work with to help keep me organized and know which students are going in which groups, what I've taught, and when I need to reassess. The other form that we have is a conferencing form. And I love this form because not only does it walk you through each step of the conference, but it's also your documentation for you right there. So both the small group tracking form and the conferencing form are available in our Teachers Pay Teachers store. And because we're hosting this webinar, we're actually offering you 10% off of all of our resources in our store. Our starter pack is also on sale, and our starter pack has absolutely everything you need to get balanced math up and running in your classroom. I use those resources on a daily basis. Our starter pack includes that 30-day launch plan I mentioned earlier. You'll want to get your hands on that because it will really set you up for success. So make sure that you visit our Teachers Pay Teachers store, get your 10% off, and that way you can get off to a really great start. Now, before we wrap up, we need to finish talking about the wrap up for guided math. So wrap up is where your whole group reconvenes and the lesson is wrapped up and learning connections are shared as a group. You can also use this time for an exit ticket, which will help inform your instruction and your groups for the next day. So before we get to our invitation and questions, I have a parting thought that I want to leave you with. Wendy Wardhofer in her book, Minds on Mathematics says, with the support of a skilled coach and the challenge of collegial mathematicians and the gift of time to think, all learners can and should become proficient mathematicians. What part of this quote resonates with you? For me, it was the challenge of being a proficient coach, but it was also that I really, really, really wanted to give my students the gift of time to think. I was so tired of force-feeding my students, forcing them to learn, and getting very, very little true learning in return. So using a balanced math model has really kind of brought peace to my classroom. It has truly transformed the way that I teach. It's transformed the way that my students learn. And my students actually come into math saying, this is my favorite part of the day, or I love learning math. And more than once I hear, hey, are we doing zones today? And they